So for today's topic, I'm going to be looking at Matthew chapter 7, and we're going to be reading through a few verses in this chapter. I'm also going to be saying a bunch of references here and there, but I'm just going to summarize them quickly because we don't have to look into those. You can look at the references later in your own time, but for now, we're just going to look through this chapter, at least some of the verses. So now you guys all see from your headings what this topic is about. It's a very familiar passage to us. Before I guess, delve in, I'm just going to read those few verses. We're going to be looking at from the first 5 verses, verses 1 to 5. Judge not that you be not judged. For with what judgment you judge, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not consider the plank in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me remove the speck from your eye, and look, a plank is in your own eye? Hypocrite, first remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. So yeah, this is a very familiar passage to us. But for today's topic, I'm not just going to be focusing on judging people, but how do we know the difference, or I guess the boundary line between when is it considered being judgmental and when is it considered correcting them or giving them an encouraging word of correction. So one thing that I'm not sure if all of you are able to relate with this, but I've heard a lot of people use the first verse kind of out of context. It's often used by people who want to, at least in modern times, that they want to silence their critics. They use basically the first part of it. They say, judge not. And they say, oh, you can't say those things. Don't you know the Bible says you can't judge? You shouldn't judge. So the question I'm trying to ask today is that what this passage is saying? Or is there something else that we have to look deeper into? So yeah, a lot of times people use this to say that another person doesn't have the right to tell me that I'm wrong. And in fact, most people only focus on those few words. So it's reached the point where, I guess today, a lot of Christians feel like they're walking on eggshells because they don't know if they can speak out against their own fellow believers. I'm not talking about politics or anything. I'm talking about our own fellow believers. When you see something that you think that, okay, that person or that brother is doing something that you think is wrong, but you want to give them advice or some just helpful words, but you don't want to come off as saying or sounding too judgmental to them. So the question this morning we're looking at is, if we are not allowed to judge others, are we allowed to discern between what's right and wrong? Or are we allowed to say something is moral or immoral? And the last one is, are we allowed to say something is true or another thing is a lie? Because when you're in that situation, when you have to declare that something is immoral or something is a lie, you've already passed a judgment on it. So when you're looking at the first 5 verses of this chapter, we see that Jesus is talking about being hypocritical, and he's advising Christians, or at least those who are listening in his audience right here during this Sermon on the Mount, that they shouldn't criticize others. But is this all that he's saying is the question. So verse 2 kind of gives more insight on this first verse. It says that with whatever measure you use to judge, the same measure will be used on you. A lot of people nowadays in the world are saying or arguing that morality is relative. And that means that some people can say that one thing is considered moral, while another group of people can say that that same thing is immoral. During our Saturday meeting, our youth have been reading through the book Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. And in that book, Lewis does a great job of breaking down how the concept of relative morality doesn't really hold up. And he basically says, in order to decide between good and evil, there has to be a standard or a measure that is higher than us, so that we can compare things to it. And we as Christians believe that our moral standard is God's law, and he's given that to us. And we know that all of us have fallen short of that perfect moral standard. But it's with that same moral standard that we know what we're able to tell what's the difference between right and wrong. So Jesus is saying here that with whatever moral standard you use to judge others, you have to be prepared to be measured in the same way. So the question is, what is that moral standard? What is it that we're measuring people against? We often say it as, at least in like modern day terms, we say you have to practice what you preach. So for the second question that I asked, are we allowed to say that something is truth or a lie? Now, for the most part of like history, people didn't really question like the concept of absolute truth. It's been pretty much a very recent thing that people are now saying that some things can be true to one person, but it can be something else can be true to another person. Like it can be considered a completely different thing. I feel like I guess most of our parents might not have heard people use this in like in their words nowadays, because I feel like the kids might hear it a lot in social media. People are oftentimes saying like, oh, this person, she's speaking her truth, or he is speaking his truth. What does that mean when we say that? Or are we aware of what we're trying to say? A lot of times we're now changing this concept of an absolute truth, and we're also trying to apply the same thing with morality. We're trying to make that relative. I just want to warn like our younger people who are using social media and they're seeing these things, not to fall into that trap. The late Ravi Zacharias spoke on this, and he says that the very statement, absolute truth does not exist, contradicts itself. So you don't want to make that mistake of starting to call things that are false a truth, because that can lead you to a very dangerous place. So basically, to summarize those 2 points from looking at these first 5 verses, when we see that Jesus is telling us not to judge others, that doesn't necessarily mean that all actions are equally moral or that truth is relative. We know from plenty of other verses in the Bible that the Bible teaches that there is a moral standard, and that truth is objective, eternal, and it's an aspect of God's character. So one thing that I guess you might notice that I didn't read, I read the first 5 verses, but in most of your Bibles, the section that is divided usually includes verse 6 as well. And when you read verse 6, it seems like it's pretty much contradictory to the first 5 verses. Verse 6 says, "Do not give what is holy to the dogs, nor cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn and tear you in pieces." So what is going on with this verse, and why is that suddenly included with these first 5 verses that are basically telling us, do not judge and do not be hypocritical? And also, if you look later on in this chapter, we see another section, verses 15 to 20. And that says, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Therefore, by their fruits you will know them." So now we see Jesus talking about, he's basically talking about certain people who he's calling dogs and pigs, or he's likening them to that. And then in verses 15 to 20, you see him talking about the character of false prophets and how you are able to identify them by their fruits. But now if we're looking back at verses 1 to 5, and if that section is really saying, oh, you can't judge anyone for anything, how are we supposed to identify these false prophets if we can't make a judgment call on their character and discern for ourselves? So here Jesus is giving us the permission to be able to tell right from wrong, just like with morality and truth, and how those don't change despite his warning about judging others. That's how, just like with the morality and also with the truth, we see that these concepts don't change just because he said that you can't judge others in the beginning of the chapter. So what we see is that when Jesus is saying, do not judge, that doesn't mean that anything goes. Many churches out there today are kind of taking this verse out of context, and they're changing their, I guess, their core beliefs because they want to include as many people as possible. They're afraid of calling people out on their sin or on their character flaws. And they introduce this sometimes questionable theology into the church just so that they can expand their numbers. And we know that's obviously not correct, but we also have to be wary of how we phrase our language as well. When we look at John chapter 7, verse 24, you see something that Jesus is saying that seems like, oh, it's contradictory to this as well. John chapter 7, verse 24 says, judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment. So now we see something else here is being presented. There's something such as righteous judgment, and so there's also something such as unrighteous judgment. We see that there's a right way to judge and an incorrect way to judge. If we're looking at this verse and also a few others, we can get more of a clear picture on what is the right way to judge and what is the wrong way to judge. And hopefully when we're using that, we can go back to verses 1 to 5 of Matthew chapter 7, and we can hopefully see that what is it that Jesus is saying here. So I'm going to present to you 5 types of unrighteous or wrong judgment that we should stay away from. And if you want to take notes, you can write them down. I'll just list them by like their names. These are just arbitrary names. I didn't use any alliteration. Sorry for that. I know a lot of people like that with their messages. But anyway, the first one is superficial judgment. The second one is hypocritical judgment. The third one is harsh or unforgiving judgment. The fourth one is self-righteous judgment. And the fifth one is untrue judgment. So if we're looking at the first one, superficial judgment, we're already here in John chapter 7, verse 24. And in this verse, we see the first part of it says, judge not according to the appearance. So that's pretty self-explanatory. Also in Proverbs chapter 18, verse 13, you don't have to turn there, but it says that it's foolish to jump to conclusions before investigating the facts. You can't really look at a very superficial view of things or just at the appearance of people and suddenly understand everything that person is going through. We see that in one example that we see that is with Simon the Pharisee, and when he had invited Jesus into his house, he immediately judged the woman that had entered in and washed Jesus's feet. And what was he judging her based on? He was judging her based on her appearance and on her reputation and things like that. But instead, what you see is that Jesus forgave that woman, but didn't forgive Simon. And instead, he actually rebuked Simon because he had unrighteously judged this woman. You can see that in Luke chapter 7, verse 36 to 50. We don't have to read through that, but we're all familiar with those verses. The second form was hypocritical judgment. And for that, I'm returning back here to Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. I'm going to posit to you that this verse is talking specifically about hypocritical judgment. The reason why I'm saying this is because of the context surrounding this verse. In chapter 6, verse 2 and verse 5 and verse 16, Jesus is talking not specifically about judging people, but he's talking about hypocrisy in general. He's talking to the listeners and telling them, don't be like these hypocrites who do ... And then if you see later on, once again in chapter 7, from verses 3 to 5, the verses immediately after verse 1, we see once again he's talking about now hypocritical judgment. So that's why I think that from the context around chapter 7, verse 1, that this passage is specifically talking about a hypocritical form of judgment. Romans chapter 2, verse 1 also repeats this concept because it says that the one who judges condemns himself to the same judgment. That's basically saying if you are saying something but you're not practicing that same thing, that argument that you have is completely not valid because you haven't been practicing that in your own life. So he's telling you not to do this. And then the third form of judgment that I mentioned was harsh or unforgiving judgment. This is when you treat someone harshly or you're not able to forgive them because of what they've done. If we look at Titus chapter 3, verse 2, it says, to speak evil of no one and to avoid quarreling, to be gentle and to show perfect courtesy toward all people. Matthew chapter 5, verse 7 says that the merciful will be shown mercy. And when we look back again to Matthew chapter 7, verse 2, it's once again saying that you will be judged by the same measure that you use to judge others. And then the fourth form was self-righteous judgment. And now this form of judgment comes from an attitude of pride. James chapter 4, verse 6 says that God opposes the proud. And an example of this is seen in Luke chapter 18, verse 9 to 14, when Jesus is sharing the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, who were both praying in the temple. You see the difference in their prayers and how the Pharisee was, even in his prayer, he was judging the tax collector that was sitting next to him. And he was saying, he was being thankful to God that he's not like that person. And he was thinking that he's more righteous than the tax collector. But when you look at the end of that parable, you see God is the one who sees the heart, and he forgave the tax collector instead of this Pharisee. And then the fifth form was untrue judgment, and another way to say this is called bearing false witness. The Bible multiple times says that it forbids bearing false witness. In Proverbs chapter 19, verse 5, and we also see this once again in Titus chapter 3, verse 2, where it once again says, do not slander no one. So now, after mentioning all of these different forms of unrighteous judgment, now let's look at, like, what does it mean for righteous judgment? The thing that Jesus was talking about in John chapter 7, verse 24. What does it mean to have righteous judgment? A lot of times, Christians are accused of being judgmental or ignorant when they speak out against sin. But is opposing sin a wrong thing for Christians to do? I know a lot of times it seems like obviously no, but it's hard to put that into practice, because countless times, well, in the Bible, what we see is countless times the prophets in the Old Testament are being called from wherever they are by God to confront Israel about their sins. And when we look at the New Testament, we see that Jesus is constantly condemning sin time and time again. We do know that he constantly hung out with the sinners, but he spoke out against the sin. And when we look at 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 2, it says, preach the word, be ready in season and out of season. Convince, rebuke, exhort with all long-suffering and teaching. When we look at Galatians chapter 6 and verse 1, it says, brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, and considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. I like that verse because it seems like a summary of almost all of these different concepts. And then when we look at Matthew chapter 18, verse 15 to 17, Jesus gives specific instructions on dealing with the sinning brother, and that helps, of course, with church discipline. So I guess in conclusion, if we wanted to, I guess, see what we can learn from this, is hopefully we can all try to examine ourselves when these types of situations arise. When you want to give an encouraging word to someone, I would try to, take a step back and see, okay, where am I coming from? Is what I'm saying any one of these types of, is this type of judgment something that's unrighteous? Am I being prideful, or am I being unforgiving? Am I saying this in just because of a superficial type of judgment? Like I'm only seeing what is on the outside. Maybe there's something else going on. I feel like if we were to take a moment and consider those things first, it would help a lot in terms of our conversations with one another, and hopefully edifying one another. And then on the opposite end, because with this argument, there's two sides. There's the one who's giving the judgment and the one who's receiving. So on the both sides can make mistakes, of course. So I feel like I spent most of the time talking about the giving side of it, because I feel like a lot of times I'm the one, when I'm talking to people, they're the ones responding to me saying, "Oh, Charlie, you can't say that. You sound so judgmental." But That's why for me, like, I feel like that applies to me a lot. But also on the receiving side, there's a lot of times where we can see room for improvement as well. A lot of times people will say, hey, you can't judge me. The Bible says don't judge. But instead we should reflect and consider also where that person is coming from. Are they speaking because of some of their previous experiences? Are they giving advice that is coming from a place of, like, I wouldn't say judgment or unrighteous judgment, but like, say, righteous judgment? Or are they trying to encourage like each other to be better and to equip one another to be hopefully better Christians and better people in general? So once again, we shouldn't try to, we should make sure that our judgment isn't superficial or hypocritical, harsh or unforgiving, prideful or untrue. And instead, we should be always looking to build one another up by encouraging one another. And of course, it's when we look at the spiritual gifts, we see one of them is the gift of encouragement. Now, not everyone has this gift, obviously. I'm pretty sure I don't have it because I'm not very good at it. But I feel like it shouldn't be just delegated just to that one person that has a spiritual gift. We should all be trying to, encourage one another. When we see, like, I know I definitely, and like, I like hearing feedback from people, especially with my messages and things like that, even outside of like preaching, just in general. If people come up to me and say, hey, I think you did this wrong, or they say, hey, you didn't say this in a really loving way. One of the important things that we see, especially in like Galatians 6, chapter 1, it says, speak these things. Yes, you can speak these things in terms of encouragement, but you want to say it with in a loving way and in a patient way. And I know a lot of times I struggle with that because sometimes I don't say things in a way thinking of what is the other person's perspective. So I think that a lot of these things, if we can try to keep that in mind in the coming days, and hopefully in time that comes a good habit or a practice that we do actively, that we can hopefully build one another up. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the message for today. I'll just close off in a word of prayer.